Hmm. Okay, so games. That word is doing a lot of work in this title. And before I get into anything else, I want to spend a minute just sitting with what it actually means here. Because I think the specific kind of game matters, and I don't want to gloss over it. When I tune into this, what I'm not picking up is something dramatic, like someone scheming against you in some elaborate way. What I'm picking up is smaller than that and honestly more common. The kind of testing that people do, sometimes without even fully admitting to themselves that they're doing it, pulling back to see if you'll chase, going quiet to see if you'll be the one to break the silence, being a little inconsistent to see how much inconsistency you'll tolerate before you say something. That's the game. Not cruel, exactly. More like a habit. A pattern someone's used before, probably more than once, probably with some success, where they create a little uncertainty and then watch what happens. And usually, what happens is the other person adjusts, reaches out more, tries harder, becomes a little more accommodating to compensate for the uncertainty. That's what usually happens. It's not what happened with you. Let me describe what I think actually happened, because I think there's a specific sequence here, and I want to trace it properly. At some point, this person did the thing, the pulling back, or the inconsistency, or whatever specific version of it applies to your situation. And I think on their end, this was almost automatic. Not a big calculated decision, just the move they make, the thing that's worked for them before with other people in other situations, a kind of default setting. And then they waited for the response they're used to getting, the chasing, the increased effort, the slight anxiety that shows up in someone when they sense distance and try to close it. That response didn't come. I keep getting this image of someone checking something, expecting a particular reading, and getting a different number instead. Like they pulled back and then they kept checking, watching, waiting for the usual signal that the game was working, and the signal just wasn't there. Not because you were playing it cool or strategically not responding, because you genuinely weren't playing. You just continued doing what you do, living your life. Not less warm, exactly, but not more anxious either. Steady. And steady, when someone's expecting a reaction, can be unsettling in a way that a reaction wouldn't be. Has there been a moment like that where you can almost feel, in retrospect, that someone was expecting something from you that didn't come, and there was this kind of pause on their end, like they were recalibrating? Tell me in the comments, because I think there's a specific moment here, even if it didn't feel significant to you at the time. Um, I want to talk about why your response was different from what this person was used to. Because I don't think it was a strategy on your part. I don't think you were consciously playing it cool or following some kind of advice about not chasing. I think it's more fundamental than that. What I'm sensing is that you have a baseline, a kind of internal standard for how you engage with people, how much energy you put in, how present you are. And that baseline doesn't really fluctuate based on what other people do. It's not reactive, it's just yours, consistent, because it comes from inside you, not from trying to match or respond to someone else's behavior. So when this person pulled back, expecting your engagement to drop too, expecting some kind of mirroring, what they encountered instead was just you, the same you, not performing unaffected, genuinely, just continuing to be who you are, because who you are isn't contingent on someone else's behavior toward you. I think that's what threw them, not coldness from you, the absence of a reaction that would have confirmed the game was working. And here's the thing about that: when someone's pattern relies on getting a particular reaction and they don't get it, there's a kind of disorientation that follows. Like the script they're used to following suddenly doesn't have the next line. And in that gap, in that absence of the expected response, something else starts to happen. They start to actually notice you, not the reaction they're trying to provoke you. Let me go into what I think this person has been noticing in that gap. What I'm picking up is a kind of grudging respect. I say grudging because I don't think it's comfortable for them. I think part of what's happening is that they're realizing something about themselves through their interaction with you that they probably weren't trying to learn. Here's what I mean. If your steadiness, your lack of reactivity, your not chasing comes from a real internal foundation, something solid that doesn't need external validation to hold its shape, then by comparison, the games this person plays start to look like what they actually are: a way of generating reactions because their own sense of security depends on getting them. Testing people, in a sense, is often less about the other person and more about needing constant reassurance that you matter to them, that they're invested, that pulling away produces a response. When that test doesn't land, when the other person doesn't produce the reassurance, it doesn't just mean this person isn't reacting. It can also mean uncomfortably, maybe I'm the one who needed something here and I didn't get it. And that's a different kind of realization, less about you, more about themselves. And I think that's actually what's happening. This person is in the process of learning something about their own patterns, using you as the unexpected mirror, not because you set out to teach them anything. Just because your steadiness didn't give them what they were looking for, and the absence of that thing made them notice, maybe for the first time in a while, that they were looking for it at all. I want to talk about what they learned There Are No Games with You actually looks like in practice going forward, because I think this is the part that's actually useful. What I'm sensing is that this person's behavior towards you is going to change, but not in a dramatic, obvious way. I don't think you're going to get some big apology or some moment where they acknowledge what they were doing. That's not usually how this works. People rarely narrate their own pattern shifts out loud, especially not to the person who triggered the shift. What I think you'll notice instead is a kind of directness that wasn't there before, less testing, less of the pulling back and watching, more just saying things plainly because the indirect version didn't work and some part of them has registered that it's not going to work with you. This might show up as them being more upfront about what they want or more consistent because inconsistency didn't produce the result they were used to, so there's less incentive to keep doing it. Or it might show up as a kind of carefulness almost. Like they're choosing their words or their actions with you a little more deliberately than they used to because they've sensed that the casual approach doesn't land the same way. I think underneath all of this, there's something like respect, maybe even something a little more than respect, because people who default to games often don't actually want games deep down. They want connection, but they've learned that games are how you get attention, how you get a reaction, how you confirm someone's still invested. And when they meet someone for whom that strategy doesn't work, someone who's just present, regardless, there can be a real relief in that. Even if it's an uncomfortable relief at first, because it requires them to show up differently than they're used to. Um, Let me talk about something else I'm noticing, which is about you and how this whole situation might have felt from your side. I get the sense that while this was happening, you might not have fully registered it as a game at the time. Like, you weren't sitting there thinking, ah, I see what they're doing and I'm not going to play along. I think it was more subtle than that. I think you just were yourself, maybe with a slight awareness that something felt a little off, a little inconsistent, but without necessarily naming it or strategizing around it. And I think that's actually important because it means your steadiness wasn't a performance or a tactic or something you did because you decided to handle this person in a particular way. It was just you continuing to be you while something around you shifted. And that, I think, is part of why it landed the way it did. If you'd been visibly reacting to their behavior, even by visibly not reacting in a pointed, look how unaffected I am kind of way, that would have been its own kind of response. A different game, almost. But genuine steadiness, the kind that doesn't even register the other person's behavior as something requiring a response, that's harder to argue with. There's nothing to push against. It's just there. Have you found yourself in this situation just kind of continuing on without really making a decision about how to handle things? Like it wasn't a strategy, it was just how you naturally were. I think that's exactly what happened, and I think that's exactly why it had the effect it did. I want to talk about what comes next because I think there's a forward looking piece here that's worth exploring. What I'm sensing is that this person, having gone through this little internal recalibration, is going to approach you going forward from a slightly different place. Not necessarily more in terms of effort or attention, though that's possible too, but differently, with a kind of awareness that wasn't there before. An awareness that you're not someone who operates according to the usual rules they're used to relying on. I think this could open up something, actually. Not because games were ever going to be a good foundation for anything, they weren't, but because the absence of games creates space for something more honest. If this person is now operating with the understanding that the usual tactics don't work with you, what's left for them is just actually engaging, actually being present, because the alternative doesn't get them anything. And actual presence, even if it's a little awkward at first, even if it's someone fumbling their way into a way of relating that's new for them, is a lot more useful ultimately than whatever the game version was. If something develops from here, and I think it's going to be built on a foundation that's at least a little more solid than what came before, because the foundation that came before wasn't really a foundation. It was a test. And tests don't build anything, they just measure. I want to address something that might be on your mind, which is whether any of this matters. Like, okay, this person learned something, fine, but does that actually change anything for you? Or is this just an interesting observation about their internal process that doesn't really affect your life either way? I think it does matter, but maybe not in the way you'd expect. What I'm picking up is that your steadiness here wasn't just relevant to this one situation. It's part of a broader pattern in how you move through your relationships generally. And I think increasingly this is becoming known about you not in a dramatic, everyone's talking about how you handle things way, more quietly. People who've interacted with you, who've tried the usual tactics and found that they don't land, start to adjust how they approach you, even if they couldn't articulate why. Over time, this means the people who remain close to you, who keep engaging with you, are increasingly the people for whom games were never necessary. Because the ones who relied on that kind of dynamic either learn, like this person seems to be learning, or they drift away toward people whose reactions are easier to provoke. So, in a sense, what's happening here is a kind of filtering, not something you're doing on purpose, just a natural effect of who you are. People who need games either learn not to play them with you or they find someone else to play them with. Either way, the relationships that remain, that develop, that continue, tend to be ones built on something more solid. Let me also say something about the emotional layer here, because I don't want this to sound purely strategic or transactional, like this is all just about dynamics and patterns. I think there's a real tenderness underneath what's happening with this person, even if it's not obvious yet, because the games people play are often a defense against vulnerability, a way of staying protected, of not fully showing up, of keeping enough distance that if things don't go well, it doesn't hurt as much. When that defense doesn't work, when it doesn't produce the expected effect, there's an opening, a moment where the person might even briefly drop the defense just because it's not serving its purpose anymore. And in that moment, something more real can come through. Not necessarily a grand confession, maybe just a small moment of genuine presence where the usual guardedness isn't there. I think you might see a glimpse of that with this person sometime soon. A small moment where they're a little more themselves than usual. Less performing, less testing, just there. And I think it's worth noticing if it happens because it's actually significant, even if it doesn't look like much on the surface. I want to close with something about you because I think this whole situation, more than being about teaching this person a lesson in a kind of cosmic comeuppance sense, is actually more about something you already had that just became visible through contrast. You have a kind of solidity that doesn't depend on external confirmation. That's not something that developed because of this situation. It's something that was already there. And this situation just happened to be a context where it became noticeable, where it produced an effect because it met something, a pattern, a game, a test that depended on the absence of exactly that kind of solidity to work. I don't think you need to think of this as a victory exactly. It's not really a competition, even though they learned a lesson can sound like one. It's more like you were just yourself in a situation where being yourself happened to reveal something to someone else about themselves. That's not a small thing, but it's also not something you did to them. It's something that happened because of who you already are. And who you already are isn't going anywhere. This person learned something about that this time. And if anyone else in the future tries the same kind of thing, expecting the usual response, I think they're going to learn the same thing for the same reason. There's no game to win with you because you're not playing one. That's not a strategy. That's just who you are.